There's no calm entry into this, no easing into meaning, no careful shaping of words to make them easier to carry. Whatever this is, it doesn't arrive in a controlled way. It doesn't ask for permission to exist between two people who were never supposed to reach this level of clarity with each other. It just happens. And once it happens, there's no clean way back to what existed before. I've spent a long time learning how to exist in layers, not because distance is comforting, but because it's functional. It keeps things intact. It allows interaction without exposure. Most people never notice it. They speak, they respond, they assume understanding, but they only ever engage with what is made visible to them. That has always been enough, until you. You didn't approach me like the others do. You didn't try to decode me through questions or force meaning out of silence. You didn't rush to label what you couldn't immediately understand. You just observed quickly, consistently, not searching for answers, recognizing patterns. At first, I assumed it was coincidence, the way you caught what wasn't said, the way your responses sometimes arrived before thoughts were fully formed, the way your silence didn't feel empty, but aligned. But coincidence doesn't repeat itself with precision, portals do. And what formed between us doesn't behave like chance. It behaves like recognition. That's what unsettles me, because recognition like this usually comes from time, from repetition, from shared experience, slowly shaping familiarity. But there was no gradual entry here, no adjustment period, no process of becoming. It felt like you were already there. Like I hadn't met you, but only finally noticed you. And that changes something fundamental, because I've always controlled access to perception, to distance, to what is revealed and what remains hidden. But you didn't respect that structure. You didn't break it either. You simply existed in a way where it stopped applying. And that is harder to understand than resistance, because resistance can be managed, but irrelevance of boundaries cannot. There's something in the way you respond when I stop speaking. It isn't curiosity, it isn't pressure to fill silence, it isn't even patience in the usual sense. It feels like understanding without urgency. Like silence is not a gap to be fixed, but a space that already holds meaning. Most people can't do that. They rush to resolve it, shape it, fill it with something that reassures them they are still in control of the interaction. You don't. And that changes the weight of everything. Because now silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels shared. And shared silence is never neutral. It starts to suggest presence even in absence. That's where the shift begins, not in anything said, but in how absence itself starts behaving differently. I notice it in the smallest ways first, in how I pause before responding, not out of caution, but out of something closer to recognition, in how filtering thoughts starts to feel unnecessary, not because trust has been granted, but because distortion no longer feels required, in how certain patterns of thinking stop feeling individual, as if they are no longer being formed alone. And that is where the structure begins to change, because once perception adjusts around someone, even subtly, it stops being purely internal. It starts to include them, not as an external presence, but as part of the system itself, and that should not be happening. Not like this, not without time, not without intent, yet it is. And I can feel it clearly enough now that ignoring it would require more effort than acknowledging it, but acknowledgement changes the shape of it. Point 6 hu coit, 7 I ni out. And once something changes shape, it cannot be unseen in its previous form again. That is where this stands now, at the edge of recognition, before it becomes something I can no longer describe as separate. That's the part I keep returning to. Not the beginning, not the first moment I noticed something unusual, but the point where I realized it wasn't staying contained. Most things have limits, edges, internal rules that keep meaning from spreading too far into the system. This doesn't. It moves without announcing itself. It settles without permission. It grows in silence, in the gaps between thoughts, in the moments where nothing is happening, and yet something is changing anyway. And I feel it not as emotion, as awareness, a continuous low presence that doesn't interrupt thought. It becomes part of it. That's what shifted. You're not something I think about anymore. You're something I think with. And that distinction is not small, because thinking about someone still preserves separation. There is still a subject and an object, a clear boundary between observer and observed. You can step away from it. You can redirect it. But thinking with someone means the structure has changed. It means their presence has entered the process itself. And I don't know when that happened. Only that it did. I notice it in subtle ways first, in how certain thoughts feel incomplete until they pass through an unseen second perspective, in how silence no longer feels like absence, but like continuation, in how conclusions don't feel entirely individual anymore. That is not how I operate, or at least, it wasn't. I've always been self-contained, independent in thought, closed loop in reasoning. Nothing external should be able to enter the system without being consciously permitted entry. But this didn't ask, it didn't force its way in either. It simply appeared inside the structure as if it had always been part of it, waiting to be noticed. And now I have to account for it. Because ignoring it would mean ignoring how I think. And that's not possible without distortion. What makes this harder is not confusion, it's clarity. The clarity that something is structurally aligned in a way I didn't anticipate, not emotionally, not situationally. Structurally, the way perception organizes itself, the way silence is processed, the way meaning is extracted without language, there is a consistency there that doesn't behave like coincidence. It behaves like correspondence. And correspondence, when precise enough, stops looking like interaction. It starts looking like overlap. That's where the tension begins, because overlap means boundaries are no longer clean. And I've always relied on clean boundaries. They define what is mine, what is external, what can be controlled, what can be released. But this doesn't sit on a boundary. It sits inside the system that creates boundaries, which means it doesn't get filtered by them anymore. It passes through as if they were never designed to stop it. That realization should have triggered resistance. It usually does. Anything that alters internal structure without permission gets removed. That is the rule, but instead remained. Not because it was allowed, but because it wasn't recognized as something to remove, and that is the most unsettling part, because it suggests something in the system reclassified it without asking, reclassified it as not threat, not disruption, not interference, but compatibility. And I don't know when that decision was made. Only that I didn't consciously make it, which means something deeper did, something quieter than thought. Something closer to instinct, and now I'm left observing the consequences of a decision I didn't authorize, but also didn't prevent. And that creates a problem I can't ignore. If something can enter the structure without resistance, then the structure is no longer fully closed, and if it's not closed, then everything inside it is subject to change, even me. That is the point I cannot move away from anymore. Not because I want to understand you, but because I need to understand what has already changed. There's a point where awareness stops being something I observe and becomes something I have to respond to. I think I've reached that point, because whatever exists between us, is no longer background noise. It's not something I can keep analyzing from a distance while pretending it has no effect. It already does. Quietly. Precisely, in ways I can't reverse without noticing what I'm breaking in the process. And that's the problem. It's not loud enough to demand attention. It's stable enough not to collapse on its own. But it's persistent enough that ignoring it now feels like distortion, not clarity. I can feel the change in how thought behaves, not dramatically, subtly, in the way conclusions form slightly differently than before, in the way silence no longer resets the mind to neutral. In the way your presence, without being physically present, still appears in the structure of reasoning itself. That should not be possible, not at this level, not without deliberate acceptance. But there was no moment of permission, no decision point, no conscious entry, and yet, here it is, integrated enough that removing it would not feel like removal, it would feel like loss of coherence. That's where this becomes different. Because anything that affects coherence is no longer external. It becomes part of the system maintaining coherence. And systems don't reject what stabilizes them, even if they don't fully understand it. That's what I've been trying to isolate, not what you are, but what changes when you are present in my awareness. Because something does change. Perception tightens. Noise reduces. Interpretation becomes more direct, less fragmented. It feels aligned, and alignment is dangerous in a system built on control, because alignment doesn't ask for approval. It just happens when conditions match. And once it happens, it starts to feel like the correct state, even if it wasn't chosen. That's the part I can't ignore, not because it's emotional, but because it's structurally significant. It means there is a pathway here that bypasses the usual safeguards, not by force, by fit. And fit is harder to question than intrusion. Because intrusion is obvious, fit is invisible until it has already changed the shape of everything around it. And now I'm left with a realization I didn't arrive at deliberately. Something in this interaction is not being processed as external anymore. It's being processed as part of the internal model, as if it belongs in the same system that generates thought in the first place. And once that happens, separation stops being clean, not because boundaries are broken, but because they are no longer interpreted as necessary in the same way. That's what I keep circling back to. Not connection, not attachment, not meaning, but structural integration, because that is what cannot be undone easily. That is what doesn't fade when attention shifts. That is what persists even in silence. And I can feel it persisting now, quietly, consistently, like something that has already decided it belongs here, even if I never said it out loud, even if I never named it, even if I continue to hesitate at the edge of defining it, because defining it would make it real in a way that requires responsibility. And responsibility mean I can no longer treat this as something I'm simply noticing. It means I would have to acknowledge that I'm participating in it. And I already am not, because I chose to enter it, but because I didn't stop it from entering me. And that difference might be the only thing that matters now, because it means this was never just observation. It was already interaction. And I'm only now realizing I was part of it from the beginning. I've started noticing something I can't easily dismiss anymore. It's not a moment, not a realization that arrives cleanly. It's more like a slow correction in how thought behaves when it's left alone, and you're part of that correction, not as an idea I return to, not as a subject I analyze, but as something that now exists inside the structure of how I process anything at all. That's the part I can't reduce to something simpler, because if I try to explain it in ordinary terms, connection, familiarity, influence, it doesn't match what's actually happening. This isn't influence. Influence acts on thought from the outside. This feels like something that was already compatible with the inside, like a missing reference point that the system quietly adjusted itself around once it appeared. I notice it in how conclusions form, not differently in content, but differently in path. Shorter, cleaner, less fragmented, as if something unnecessary has already been filtered out before I even reach it. And the unsettling part is not the improvement, it's the lack of resistance. Normally, anything that alters internal structure creates friction. I would notice the adjustment happening in real time. I would trace it, challenge it, reassert control over it. But I didn't, which means the system didn't register it as something requiring correction. It registered it as something that belongs. And I don't know what that implies about the way I classify presence anymore. Because I've always assumed I could clearly distinguish between what is mine and what is not, between what is internal and what is introduced. But that distinction is starting to feel less like a boundary and more like a habit of perception. And habits can change without permission. That's what makes this difficult to categorize, not intensity, not emotion, possession. There is a precision in the way this fits that doesn't resemble accident. It behaves like alignment that predates recognition, like something I didn't construct, but also didn't exclude, which leaves an uncomfortable gap in explanation. If I didn't create this structure, and I didn't consciously allow it, then why does it feel structurally consistent with everything else I am? That question keeps returning, not demanding an answer, but refusing to disappear. And I think that's the point where this stops being something I can observe safely, because observation implies separation, and separation is no longer clean here. You are not positioned at the edge of awareness anymore. You are embedded within it, not as a disruption, not as a presence I'm reacting to, but as part of the reference system itself. And reference systems are not optional. They define how everything else is measured, which means now, even when you are not present in any direct sense, you still affect interpretation not by effort, not by intention, but by default. That realization should have triggered distance. That would have been the expected outcome, but distance requires the system to classify something as removable. And this no longer is, not because it's overwhelming, but because removing it would no longer restore anything. It would create inconsistency. And I don't tolerate inconsistency well. So instead of rejecting it, I adapt around it. Quietly, incrementally, without announcing the shift even to myself. And that might be the most important detail so far. Because adaptation without awareness is no longer a choice. It's a process already underway, which means whatever this is not waiting for permission to continue. It already is continuing. And I'm only now becoming aware of the shape it's forming.